following scenario is probably an experience that you can relate to at least some degree. Let's imagine that Thanksgiving is coming up. You're thinking about the excellent turkey, the carefully prepared stuffing, and really all the delicious food that you're going to be eating. Perhaps you're thinking about the football game that'll be on and whether your team's going to win. And then you start to reflect on the fact that also many of your family and extended family will be there sitting around the dinner table with you. And you imagine all of them engaged in jovial conversation, catching up on all the events of the past year and seeing what everyone is up to with their lives. And this all sounds great. But then you realize that unfortunately there's a dark underside to the situation. Because you also remember that many of these cherished family members that you'll be enjoying this meal with have very strong and divergent views about morality, ethics, politics, and religion. And you start to actually shake a little bit. Maybe your palms get a little sweaty. You're starting to think about and get very nervous about the fact that there could be disagreement at the Thanksgiving dinner table. In fact, every year we see articles in the news about people who are just in this situation, describing the sort of nervousness and anxiousness and anxiety they have about the holidays coming up and the disagreements of their family members who are coming together for the first time that year. Now, I think this is an interesting phenomena because we might say, well, why should this make us nervous? Granted, people disagree, granted, people see the world differently, but why should this necessarily be a situation or a scenario that we dread or get nervous or anxious about? And I think the answer lies in the fact that if you can relate to the situation, if you felt such anxiety, it's not just the disagreement that is making you nervous and anxious. It's the fact that that disagreement often devolves into heated or angry rhetoric. Right, and you may have been in this situation yourself where, let's say, you debate a political or ethical or religious matter with a friend, and maybe you start off making some reasonable and rational points in a calm way, but eventually it devolves in close to a shouting match. And this is a phenomena I want to explore in this video, namely the phenomena of why ethical disagreement so often devolves into heated rhetoric. And what I want to explore are a couple things. First, why is it that when we're talking about what's right or wrong, what is just or unjust, or what should be done in a political or religious sphere, why is it that when we discuss these topics, we so often get angry with one another? And furthermore, once we've delved further into the causes of that conflict, I want to consider and think about, are there any ways in which that conflict might be avoided? As explained by the author of our textbook, this phenomenon of angry and heated disagreement really just seems to be a core characteristic of ethical disputes themselves. She explains this point in the following way. One thing we know for sure about ethics is that it concerns matters in conflict, dilemmas, matters that people get upset about and argue about. So the question is, what might those be? What is the reason? What is the fundamental underlying reason that when we're engaged in an ethical dispute or a political dispute, we think there's a high probability, or at least a decent chance, that there could be heated rhetoric and angry disagreement? And this concern is not just something that's a contemporary concern in our society, it's a very old and ancient concern. And to prove this to you, I want to show you a discussion along these lines that was found in a very old piece of philosophical writing, namely one of the dialogues of the ancient Greek philosopher Plato. And the dialogue in particular that I want to look at is a dialogue entitled the Euthyphro. Now, all of Plato's dialogues take place as a conversation between different characters, and in the vast majority of cases, Socrates is the main character. Now, in this particular dialogue, the Euthyphro, we see Socrates and this other person, Euthyphro, engaged in a discussion about the nature of morality. Namely, their main concern is, how do we know what the right thing to do is? How do we know that we're acting in an ethically correct manner? And the suggestion that Euthyphro makes is that we can know what the right thing to do is, and he, in fact, knows that what he is doing is correct because the gods love what is doing, because the gods would agree with his actions. And the basic idea is that if the gods would love our actions, then they're good ones, and if the gods hate some action, then it is a bad one. Now, the observation that Socrates makes about this point really arises from some facts about Greek mythology. In the more popular monotheistic religions of today, God is one thing, God is a unity, and God does not disagree with himself. But in ancient Greek mythology, the gods were in some sense much more like human beings. They had their own interests and desires, and they often did engage in angry conflict. And both in the course of the discussion, both Euthyphro and Socrates notice this. So Euthyphro gives the following example. Zeus is the best and most just of the gods, yet they agree that he bound his father because he unjustly swallowed his sons, and that he in turn castrated his father for similar reasons. That certainly is a very clear instance of conflict between the gods. And Socrates later reiterates this point. He says, "We have also stated that the gods are in a state of discord, that they are at odds with each other, Euthyphro, and that they are at enmity with each other. Has that too been said? It has." So they both point out that the gods disagree vigorously with one another, even to the point of violent conflict. Now, why does this matter? Well, it matters for two reasons. First, it shows that Euthyphro's attempt to say that whatever the gods love is the right thing has a bit of a flaw, because if they all disagree about what is good and bad, if they love and hate different things, we don't really have clear moral guidance. But for our purposes, the importance of this point is somewhat different. One of the things that we see Socrates concerned about here is not just the fact that the gods do disagree, but he wants to know, why do they disagree? What is it that causes them to engage in these angry conflicts? And I think by looking at Socrates' comments on this point, maybe we can come to understand why we have our own angry conflicts. We can come to better understand what is it that causes us to use angry and heated rhetoric in ethical, moral, and political disputes. Now, in order to answer the question of what causes angry disagreement, whether among the gods of the ancient Greek mythology or among people today, what we can do, and in fact what Socrates did in the dialogue De Euthyphro, is distinguish between three different kinds of statements or three different subjects. Again, Socrates asked the question, what are the subjects of difference, the things people disagree about that cause hatred and anger? And here we're going to look at three different types of statements: logical statements, factual statements, and normative statements. So let's start with logical statements, and we'll start with the Euthyphro and then look at Newton's explanation of these points. So the first suggestion, the first kind of statement Socrates identifies, he explains in the following way. He says, let us look at it in this way. If you and I were to differ about numbers as to which is greater, would this difference make us enemies and angry with each other? Or would we proceed to count and soon resolve our difference about this? Euthyphro says we would certainly do so. Right, so let's say we're having a very odd disagreement about whether 2 or 4 was the larger number. Now, it's unlikely we would have such a disagreement, but maybe with a larger or more complex number, perhaps we could have a disagreement we could have a disagreement of that sort. Now, the question he's asking is, how would we go about resolving this disagreement? Well, he says, look, if we want to resolve the disagreement, we just have to count. You count to 2, I count to 4. We see who has to count more to get to their number. And of course, whoever has to count more to get to their number has the larger number. There's a clear and sort of precise way of determining the answer to this question. And so for that reason, Socrates says, look, it's very unlikely that this is the sort of thing people would fight angrily about. Right, at your Thanksgiving dinner table, people might fight angrily about whether you should vote Republican or Democrat, but they're very unlikely to fight over whether 2 or 4 is a larger number, or whether a triangle or a square has more sides. These just are not the sorts of things that cause angry disagreement. And the reason for this is because these subjects deal in what we're going to call logical statements. And Newton explains the nature of these statements in the following way. She says logical or formal statements are definitions or statements derivable from definitions, including the entirety of mathematical discourse. So, for instance, 2 plus 2 equals 4, a square has 4 equal sides. Now, what does she mean when she says these are derivable from definitions? Well, just think about it this way. If you know what the concept of 2 is, and you know what the concept of 4 is, and you know what the plus sign and the equal sign mean, if you know the definition or meaning of all those things, then you instantly know that 2 plus 2 equals 4 is true. Provided you understand what a square is, you also know it must necessarily have 4 equal sides. And if you're unsure about that statement, the reason isn't because you haven't had enough experience in the world, it's just because you don't know the definition of a square properly. And this characteristic of all we need to know is the definition of the terms to know the statement is true is a characteristic of logical statements. And that means that, as Newton explains, false statements in this category must be self-contradictory. She gives the example, if you say 2 plus 2 equals 5, or you start talking about round squares, you contradict yourself. You assert what cannot possibly be true. Because if you're talking about a round square, you're not talking about a square anymore. If you say 2 plus 2 equals 5, you're just fundamentally confused about numbers. And so a logical truth or a logically valid statement is something that can never be false. And importantly, what this means is that for us to know, for instance, that a square has 4 sides, we don't need to go out and find every square in the world. We don't need to find everything in the world that's a square and say, well, does this have 4 sides or 3 or 5? No, because if we come across anything with 3 or 5 sides, we know it's not a square. So logical truths do not depend on any facts about the world. They're true in virtue of their internal structure or true in virtue of the definition of the terms used. And there are many examples of these. Here are some more examples. Again, 2 plus 2 equals 4, 5 is greater than 2, triangles have 3 sides, each side of a square is of equal length, all bachelors are unmarried males, all human beings are mammals. Right? You can no more deny that triangles have 3 sides than you can deny that all human beings are mammals. If you say you found a human being that isn't a mammal, well, then you're just confused about what a human being is, because a human being is a biological category in which every member of that category is a mammal. So all logical statements are necessarily true, and necessarily true by the definition of their terms. Furthermore, it is because logical statements are true just in virtue of the definition of their terms that there's no need to fight about them. All we need to do is get clear on what the terms or definitions in the statement mean, and we can all agree that the statement is either true or false. Now let's turn to a second kind of statement. Let's think about what we will call factual statements. And again, let's turn to the text of Euthyphro. So Socrates now makes the following point. He says, again, if we differed about the larger and the smaller, we would turn to measurement and soon cease to differ. And about the heavier and the lighter, we would resort to weighing and be reconciled. So let's make a few points here. Sometimes it really is difficult to determine whether one object is larger than another. It may depend on the angle you're looking at the object from, the distance you are from it, and insofar as we all occupy different situations or places in the world, we might look at 2 objects and at first very much be not on the same page about which is larger or smaller or which is heavier or lighter. But of course, what Socrates points out is that this is not likely in the long term to devolve into angry conflict. Because if that really is the issue, then we have an objective way of determining this question. If we want to know which of the 2 objects is longer, we can get a ruler, which provides an objective standard that transcends our particular points of view. If we want to know which object is heavier, then we can just get a scale and use that objective measure, as opposed to our subjective points of view or subjective views on this matter. So once again, just like logical statements, with factual statements, the point Socrates wants to make is that while there might be more opportunity for conflict here, insofar as we have objective means of measurement in answering the question, it's not likely that we're going to just sort of bottom out in an angry disagreement. And this is because of some fundamental facts about what we're calling factual or empirical statements. As Newton claims, these statements are assertions about the world out there, the physical environment of our existence, including the entirety of scientific discourse, from theoretical physics to sociology. And so, what this means is a factual statement is making a claim of fact about the world, about the physical world, whether that world is very small particles of theoretical physics, or about the principles of psychology of the human mind, or economic principles that govern transactions in society. All of these would be examples of factual statements. And they can be verified. We can test to see whether they're true or false by controlled observation. And this is what scientists do. You come up with experiments, you run the experiments, you examine the results, and you see if the initial hypothesis is true or false. Now, not all factual statements require that sort of sophisticated observation. Some factual statements are much more simple, as, what's the weather outside, or how tall is a certain person. And we can verify these just by using our senses, using our sight, our smell, our taste of touch, and feel and hearing. All of these will give us all sorts of information about facts about the world. Now, one thing you'll notice that makes these statements different from logical statements is that all of these statements, the way we know whether they're true or not, depends on experience. Right, so for instance, let's take the example that Newton uses. It's raining outside. How do we know if it's raining outside? Well, we look and we see if it's raining outside. And she says on the day she wrote this, it is actually true that it's raining. But of course, it's likely that maybe tomorrow it won't be raining. So whereas it's always necessarily true that a triangle has three sides, the statement that it is raining outside is sometimes true and sometimes false. It depends on the day, and it always has to be verified by our observation. So here are some other statements that would fall into this category. Ryan is tall, it's raining outside, a family of 4 lives at 292 West Bramble Street. Next week, the temperature will reach 90 degrees. Recent changes to tax policy will result in GDP growth over the next year. These first two categories show that some factual statements are relatively straightforward and just the average person can determine their truth using their 5 senses, and others will require a much more detailed and rigorous scientific method. Finally, there's others that will have, as we'll see, a more prevalent role in our moral reasoning. For instance, consider the factual statements, lying to my siblings will hurt their feelings, or Americans have roughly split opinions on the ethics of the death penalty. Both of these are about moral matters, lying or the death penalty, but also notice that both of them are factual statements. They're claims of fact about the world that we can verify or we can undermine or deny on the basis of observation. Now, again, the main point here for our purposes is the following. While there can be some conflict about factual statements, the hope is that in the long run, we can arrive at consensus. And we can arrive at consensus on these factual claims by using either just our sort of innate abilities of sense perception, our use of our sight or our touch or our hearing, etc., or through the scientific method. The idea is that it really doesn't make sense to get into angry disagreement about factual claims because we have some objective method of determining whether they're true or false. So we have seen that logical and factual statements are different in various respects. But there's one important respect in which Socrates thinks these statements are similar. And that is the respect in which he believes neither of these is very likely to cause sustained angry disagreement. We're not going to spend a lot of time arguing about whether triangles have 3 sides. We're not going to spend a lot of time getting into an angry argument about whether someone is above 6 feet tall. There are clear methods of determining the truth on these questions. But that is not the case in Socrates' view for this last category of statements, which we're going to call normative statements. So let's again return to the text of the Euthyphro. Socrates says, what subjective difference would make us angry and hostile to each other if we were unable to come to a decision? Perhaps you do not have an answer ready, but examine as I tell you whether these subjects are the just and the unjust, the beautiful and the ugly, the good and the bad. Are these not the subjects of difference about which, when we are unable to come to a satisfactory decision, you and I and other men become hostile to each other whenever we do? And I think, and as an initial statement here, I think Socrates is certainly onto something. Let's think of some statements that would fall into these categories of the just, the beautiful, and the good. Think about the statement, the death penalty is just, or the death penalty is unjust. Certainly, we can imagine people fighting angrily about that. It happens all the time. What about aesthetic statements about beauty? What if you said the Mona Lisa is the most beautiful painting that there is? Many people with a very high degree of investment in art and art criticism would certainly, maybe some would agree, some would disagree, and they may very well engage in heated disagreement about that question. What about good and bad? What if you said lying is always bad, lying is always wrong? That's certainly a topic that can generate a lot of heated debate and discussion and rhetoric. And even if we take it out of the moral realm, what if you were to say something like LeBron James is the greatest basketball player of all time? There have been many angry disputes about that as well. So Socrates notes that when we are fighting angrily, and when there's a subject about which we can't come to an agreement, it is because that subject falls into one of these categories. It's about justice, it's about goodness, it's about beauty. And the author of our textbook, Newton, describes these kinds of statements as normative statements. They're assertions about what is right, what is good, or what should be done. One way to think about these kinds of statements is they apply a standard. When you say the death penalty is unjust, you're saying there's some standard of justice, the death penalty doesn't meet it. When you say the Mona Lisa is the most beautiful painting there is, they're saying there's some standard of excellent or transcendent beauty, and the Mona Lisa does meet that standard. So normative statements tell us what we should do, they say what is good, they apply some standard of evaluation. Now, the reason this matters in the present context, and one way in which it seems like our evaluation of these statements differs from logical and factual statements, is that we don't seem to have as clear a method of determining the truth of these kinds of statements. We said with logical statements, just pay attention to the definitions of the terms. With factual statements, just engage in either everyday observation or the scientific method. But take a statement like the death penalty is unjust. What method do we have for discovering whether that is true or false? Now, there may very well be methods, and I think there are methods we can use to answer that question. But there certainly isn't the sort of clear and straightforward, and maybe more importantly, widely accepted method we can use to determine the truth of that claim. And this is why Newton notes that when we engage in disputes about the death penalty or abortion or the ethics of lying or anything that falls in this normative category, then we become hostile, we lose our temper, and it seems like the certainties of math and science are forever beyond the grasp of our normative systems. Now, again, we can see a wide variety of normative statements. We use them all the time, which perhaps should make it even more troubling that they seem to inevitably lead to angry disagreement. So, for instance, it's always wrong to tell a lie, the death penalty is morally acceptable, there's nothing wrong with the recreational use of marijuana, nonviolent drug users should be given harsh prison sentences, abortion is a morally acceptable action, you should vote for Ryan for President of the United States. All these statements tell us what we should do, what is good, or what we should not do, or what is bad. That's what makes them normative. Now, I think it's very important to think about Why is it that Socrates accepts here that there's no clear method for determining the truth to these questions as there is in the case of logical or factual truths? And there might be two broad possibilities. One possibility is that Socrates just thinks that there is no truth to these questions. When you make a claim like the death penalty is unjust, that statement is neither true nor is it false. It's just entirely subjective, it's entirely relative. There just is no truth we're talking about here. Now, I think there's a couple reasons why we should want to reject that, and I think Socrates rejected it as well. From other works by Socrates, you see that he's engaged in a lifelong quest for knowledge of virtue and how to live a good life. And it would seem very strange that he would devote himself to ethics and morality and trying to discover how to live, and at the same time think that there was actually no answer to that question. So it seems very unlikely Socrates took that view. In addition, I don't really think that we want or actually do take that view either. There's no doubt, as we've said, that ethical disagreement happens all the time, and it's very tempting to just want to say, well, then ethics or morality must be subjective. But I'm pretty sure we can pin down certain statements or certain claims that we would think anyone should agree with. For instance, consider the following normative statement. It is always morally wrong to torture an innocent person for no other reason than the enjoyment of the torturer. I think we would all agree with that statement, and I think we would all say that not only is it true, but we know this to be objectively true, not just a matter of opinion. So when we think about why there's not a clear method for resolving ethical disagreements, I don't really think it's because there is no truth. I think the other option we should consider, and maybe is more plausible, is just that finding the truth is exceedingly difficult. It takes a long process of philosophical deliberation about the most fundamental morals and values in our society and in our lives. And I think we can see this in Socrates' own quest for philosophical knowledge about virtue and goodness. While he said he was on this lifelong quest for that knowledge, he also said the only thing he truly knew is that he doesn't have that knowledge. The only thing he truly knew is that he had no knowledge of real value. And to me, what I think that shows is that for Socrates, he recognized that normative truths, ethical truths exist, and he thought it was very valuable to find them, but ultimately he thought it was going to be very difficult to determine what they are. But insofar as we all care about these things, we all care about the death penalty or abortion or who to vote for, insofar as we all care about those things, but there is no clear method for deciding the answer to those questions, it seems we're going to inevitably be led into conflict. And not just conflict, but angry conflict. I think Socrates is right that most of the statements we fight about are normative statements. We fight about what is right and wrong, good and bad, just and unjust. But I think it's also worth pointing out that there are some pretty clear examples of factual statements, statements that should be investigated and determined their truth through scientific inquiry, that also do lead to heated disagreements. And I'll just point to two examples of these here. So, one example would be climate change is caused by human activities. Another example that we can think of are masks are an effective means of stopping the spread of COVID-19. Now, notice both of these are factual claims. Neither is normative. Neither is telling us what's good or bad. Neither is telling us what we should do or ought to do, or what the government should do, or what you as an individual should do. Both are just making a claim about the world. The first one is saying that the various effects of climate change are the results of things human beings are doing. That's a factual claim. It's also a factual claim that masks are effective at stopping the spread of COVID-19. So neither is a normative statement. Yet despite this, I think we can all agree that we have encountered and witnessed from both small scale and on a large society-wide scale really angry and heated rhetoric and disagreement about these sorts of claims. People will argue about whether climate change is actually caused by human beings. People will argue about the effectiveness of masks. And the purpose of this video isn't to delve into the science or any of the facts surrounding those cases. I merely want to make the following point. There are factual claims that do produce heated disagreement. So the thing we should ask is, does this undermine Socrates' claim? Was Socrates wrong when he said that what we really fight about is goodness and badness, justice and injustice, normative statements? Well, not necessarily. In fact, I think there's a way of looking at these conflicts over these kinds of statements that actually confirms what Socrates has said all along. Ask yourself the following question. Why is it that people fight over whether climate change is the result of human activity? Why is it that people engage in angry disagreement about masks? Right? It's probably not because they're super invested in what is merely true or factual about the world. It's because these facts seem to have implications for how we live our lives. If climate change is the result of human activities, then perhaps government policies will be needed to limit certain human activities to mitigate the effects of climate change. If masks are an effective means of stopping the spread of COVID-19, if they're needed for public health, then that might recommend certain governmental policies. I think in these kinds of cases, when it looks like what we're fighting over are scientific matters, when it looks like what we're fighting over are factual claims, oftentimes what is really motivating the disagreement and what is making the disagreement so angry and heated is because it does seem to have a political, moral, or ethical source. It seems to have a political, moral, or ethical motivation. That's what's really doing the work here. That's what's explaining the angry disagreement. So I think we can say that even in cases where it looks like we're arguing about a factual claim, sometimes the real disagreement is about a normative claim. I think there's another kind of disagreement, however, that may cause more of a problem for Socrates' claim. And that is the fact that we do sometimes seem to fight and even fight angrily about factual claims that really don't seem to matter very much. We seem to really get invested in certain trivial disagreements. And here what I have in mind are two examples of internet phenomena. The first one from 2015. This was the dress, right? You might recall this picture was going around. Some people saw it as white and gold. Some people saw it as black and blue. And people debated for weeks on end about whether the dress was really white and gold or really black and blue. The other example I have in mind was more recent, beginning in 2018, was this recording that was going around the internet that to some people sounded like it was saying Yanny, and to other people sounded like it was saying Laurel. And again, people debated for weeks on the internet what the true substance or the real substance of that recording was. Now, again, my purpose here isn't to engage in that debate, but simply notice the fact that that debate existed, that people became invested in it, and even fought angrily about this on the internet for a long period of time. Now, if Socrates' claim is that what really gets us to disagree angrily with one another are normative statements about moral, political, and ethical matters that are important to our society, and that we care about from a value-based or ethics perspective, then how does he explain these disagreements? How does he explain why the human mind is drawn to fight angrily with another person over something seemingly so trivial? I think I can offer some explanation which maybe can shed some light on disagreement more generally. The way I see it, I think probably what is going on here is that when we encounter a situation where the way we are perceiving the world in a very simple, straightforward way, right? Just the color we are seeing a dress to be, what we are hearing a recording to say. When those very simple things are not seen or heard the same way by other people, I think it can cause us to lose confidence in our ability to discover truths about the world. It can cause us to lose confidence in our senses, and our senses just are the way we get information about the world and make decisions. And that's a very uncomfortable place to be, right? It's on the one hand, it's uncomfortable enough if you gather all this information about the physical world, and then you have a hard time sort of making sense of it or interpreting it. But it's an even more difficult place to be if you start questioning well, maybe the sense data I'm getting from the world isn't even accurate. If all these other people think that the dress is blue and black and I'm seeing it as white and gold, then maybe there's something fundamentally wrong with me. And when you start to lose confidence in your ability to have a grasp on the truth, it can be very easy to sort of lash out. It can be very easy to want to defend the way you see the world as sort of a last grasp at trying to retain one's sanity, so to speak. And I think something like that is going on here. Whether the matter is trivial or whether it concerns a matter of public concern like abortion or the death penalty or climate change, human beings do have a very difficult time at tolerating disagreement. We have a very difficult time with the idea that other people see the world differently than we do. And I think also to a large extent, this can explain why so many disagreements are not just cordial, but often devolve into violent and heated rhetoric and often devolve into angry conflict. So, to some extent, I think Socrates has overstated his case. It is not only the case that we find about normative statements. In fact, it might be a curse of the human situation that we can fight over almost anything. At the same time, Socrates has made a real insight. There is a difference of degree here. We might fight over what color the dress truly is, but the sort of anger and vehemence of that fight doesn't really compare to, for instance, the fight about the ethics of abortion or the ethics of the death penalty or who we should vote for in the upcoming election. Those sorts of fights not only have a real much higher degree of anger, but can in fact break out into actual real world violence. And so I think it's worth to conclude this video to think about why that is and perhaps what can be done to prevent that to some degree. So let's think about this point more closely for a moment. Why do we fight with so much more anger and sometimes, unfortunately, even violence about matters pertaining to morality? Well, I think to start off, we can notice that ethics and morals has to do with our values. It has to do with what we think is important. It has to do with how we think it is appropriate to live our lives. And when we're talking about our values, we're also talking about our character. Right? If you were to ask someone, how do you identify? What is your self-conception? Right? A part of that would be maybe where you came from or your name, right? And various other characteristics about yourself. But probably a part of it would be also what you value, your beliefs about various moral matters. Some of those might just be sort of more mundane things about I think it's important to be honest and have integrity, but they also might be beliefs about more controversial matters, as for instance, the examples I've discussed in this video. So our values are things that shape our character, and our character is integral to how we conceive of who we are as persons. And what this means is that when you take a position on a controversial moral issue, whether it be abortion or the death penalty, who to vote for, the ethics of lying, or anything else that falls within that realm, you're often seen as making a statement about yourself and who you are. And of course, there's nothing we want to protect more than ourselves and have a sort of sense of self-preservation. So when we encounter someone who thinks differently than we do on a controversial moral issue, we might interpret that not just as them making a claim about the world, as with a factual statement, but making a claim about our character. If this person disagrees with our view on some important moral or political issue, then we might think that they are saying there's something deficient about us because there's something deficient about our values. And I think to a large extent, this can explain why people fight so hard and so angrily and even violently to protect what they see as a certain ideology or to protect their moral or political or religious beliefs. So what does this show us? Well, I think to the extent that that sort of situation is undesirable, then one thing we should try to do is separate ourselves to some degree from our moral, ethical, and political beliefs. When we encounter someone who believes something differently than we do on those questions, we shouldn't necessarily take it as a personal attack. because we shouldn't wrap our entire identity up in our answers to those questions. In fact, ideally, we would be in a situation where we would be willing to change our mind if someone else made a better argument. But of course, that's very unlikely if a large part of our identity is tied up in what we think about abortion, the death penalty, politics, or religion. But if we're going to avoid the angry conflict which ensues, then that's going to be very important. It's going to be very important to see our moral beliefs as our best attempt to say what is the right thing to do, instead of a foundational and fundamental aspect of our character and our self conception and our identity.